Today's scripture text comes to us from Luke chapter 6, starting in verse 1. And if you're using the Bibles in your pews, that's page 787. It says, one Sabbath day, Jesus was walking through the grain fields. His disciples broke off heads of wheat, rubbed off the husks in their hands, and ate the grains. But some Pharisees said, "You shouldn't be doing that. It's against the law to work by harvesting grain on the Sabbath." Jesus replied, "Haven't you ever read in the Scriptures what King David did when his companions were hungry? He went into the house of God, ate the special bread reserved for the priests alone, and then gave some to his friends. That was breaking the law too." And Jesus added, "I, the Son of Man, am master even of the Sabbath." Well, on another Sabbath day, a man with a deformed right hand was in the synagogue while Jesus was preaching. The teachers of religious law and the Pharisees watched him closely to see whether Jesus would heal the man on the Sabbath, because they were eager to find some legal charge to bring against him. But Jesus knew their thoughts. He said to the man with the deformed hand, "Come and stand where everyone can see." So the man came forward. And then Jesus said to his critics, "I have a question for you. Is it legal to do good deeds on the Sabbath, or is it a day for doing harm? Is this a day to save life or destroy it?" He looked around at them and one by one, and then said to the man, "Reach out your hand." The man reached out his hand, and it became normal again. And at this, the enemies of Jesus were wild with rage and began to discuss what to do with him. Wild with rage. So there's something Jesus is doing in this story that makes people so mad. Not only are they getting ready to bring legal charges against him, but physical violence as well. We're in chapter 6 of Luke now. We've been working our way through the Gospel of Luke, and it starts with like pretty stories of Jesus being born in a barn and, angels coming. But here we're ramping up to the point where there's tension brewing between Jesus' message and the religious leaders of his day. And so we're going to unpack that for just a little bit today. What's the Sabbath? Why does this story matter? And how does it apply to us? So whenever I ask anyone, any of you, and I go, "Hey, Bob, how are you doing?" Guess what the number one answer is that people give me? Busy. I'm really busy. Well, and that's true for some. It's not true for everyone. But your average person, you walk down the street and you go, "How are you doing?" You're like, "Oh, I'm exhausted. I'm busy. I've got so much going on. I've got to get the kids dressed for this baptism." There is no more stressful time than the hour before church in my family. You know what I mean? Just trying to get here is like pulling off a miracle, more stressful than anything Jesus did in his ministry. Whenever I'm trying to counsel couples and doing weddings, and I was just meeting with one last week, and I talked to him. I always remind him, I was like, "Guys, we walk through the whole service and all the things that are going to happen, but the most stressful thing that you're going to do that day is just showing up. It is so hard to get everything in your life ready just to get to church, just to be present for God, and there's no easy way to do it." And one of the ideas that God had, because he knew we were busy in our hearts and busy people, is he said, "I want to give you a gift." And he gave us the 10 Commandments, which are, you and I hear them as rules. If you were alive back in those days, they viewed it as a gift from God to teach them how to live. And he gives us this long list that's like, "Honor the Lord your God, and there shall have no other gods before me." And then, "Do not lie, do not cheat, do not steal," this kind of stuff. And you're like, "Okay, all right. And then there's like a curveball rule. "And take one day just to rest." That's kind of a curveball. Because you're like, okay, all these rules are like, all right, do this, do that. Wait a minute, hold on. There's one where we don't do anything? Is that a rule or not? Like, how does that work? You're going to find that it's in our nature to always want to be busy in doing things. And it's very hard for us just to be in God's presence and to rest in it. It's not natural to us, and it takes a lot of practice. I remember when I was training to be a pastor way back in the day. This was even before I knew I wanted to be a pastor. But I had to do this thing called clinical pastoral education. Did you have to do it? Yeah, he did. It's fun. It was actually, to be honest, probably one of the worst summers of my entire life. What I had to do is I was on an oncology floor, and I was their chaplain. And so I would go around all the time, and I would just knock on doors and ask if folks wanted to talk and spend time with folks. And I'm not going to lie, I was pretty good at it. All the reviews that I got back were like, "Man, this guy, I only got to spend a little time with him, but it was so awesome. And I would get those reviews back, and I would be like, yeah, I am awesome. I am pretty great. And I was really good at doing all the things that I was supposed to do, and I could make people feel all the right ways. And I would go through the motions, and I would like check that box and check that box. And my spiritual advisor, my supervisor at the time, said, Chris, man, you're doing a really good job. And I go, I know I am. I really am. And she said, yeah, but I don't think it's good for your soul. So here's what I want you to do. For the next month, not week, not day, for the next month, I want you to still come to the hospital every day. But instead of going around to people's rooms, I want you to just drop your bag off and go into the chapel, because the hospital had this little chapel. I can still picture like every detail of this chapel. She said, I want you to go into this chapel for 4 weeks and not do anything. Just sit there. Just be in God's presence and sit in the chapel and don't do anything. That was like the worst month of my life. I'm not going to lie, it was up there. It was pretty bad, because I remember what it would do is I would go in and I would spend about 5 minutes staring out the window, and then I would start to wonder, what am I going to do for the rest of the day sitting here in this room? And of course, the invitation always there was like, maybe Jesus was sitting next to me in the chair, but I didn't even know how to be with him. I didn't even know what that meant. I didn't know how to spend time with God. I didn't even know what it meant to spend time with God. I knew how to do things. I knew how to show up and be productive, but I had no idea what it meant just to be with God. And that was a new idea for me. And I know for many of you, you're used to going to church and maybe you know how to do that. But have you ever thought that maybe part of your role in life is just to be with God? And God actually said, I want you to take a whole day called a Sabbath where you're just with me. You're not busy. You're not running around. And that was a really hard thing for me to learn how to do. And Jesus shows up 2,000 years ago. And they had become masters of Sabbath keeping. In Jesus' day, the Jewish people knew that the Sabbath wasn't just like a rule to keep. It defined their identity. And so they had created all kinds of rules about how to keep the Sabbath. And so we meet this story where Jesus is with his disciples. And they're walking along the fields one day, and they're all, Jesus never like had a house where it was all stable. But if you were a Jewish person in those days and you knew the Sabbath was coming, you prepared for it in advance. Because one of the rules was you're not supposed to cook on the Sabbath. That's work. And so what you would do is you would work double the day before, prepare all the meals so that you didn't have to work on Sabbath day. And so we meet this story where Jesus is walking with his disciples, and they're hungry. And they know they're not supposed to like grab the grain and like peel it off and then eat it. That was food. But Jesus goes, guys, I know that there's a rule about not eating on the Sabbath, but what do you think? Do you think God wants you to be really hungry on the Sabbath and starving? That's not the purpose of it. It's to spend time with me. So if it helps you spend time with me, why don't you just grab some of those and eat them? And his disciples were like, Jesus, you want us to break the rules to spend time with you? Is that okay? And he was like, well, I'm in charge of the whole thing anyways. And so he said, just grab some food. Let's keep going. And they're all confused because they're like, what's more important? Like being with you, or like we've been told all our lives that doing all the right things and following all the rules is how we're right with God. And Jesus is like, you may have missed the point. Just grab it and keep walking with me. Okay, so the tension's building. Well, there's another time that comes where Jesus is preaching in a church like this. And it's a Sunday. Well, in their days, their Sabbath was a Saturday. It still is if you're Jewish. And the way that it worked was he was there, and there was a man with a shriveled hand. And we don't know much about the details. It tells us it was his right hand. Anytime he gives a detail like that in the text, that's usually symbolic of way more. Your right hand in those days represented your authority, everything you were capable of. If you were left-handed in that culture, you tried to hide it most of the time. It wasn't acceptable. Your right hand was like, did you always want to sit at the left hand of God or the right hand of God? The right hand symbolized the place of authority and power in your life and your job and your value and your status. And it says that this man's right hand was shriveled up. And we don't know if it was shriveled up for since he was born or something happened to him throughout his life. But the man was standing there, and most of his life he probably kept his hand in his shirt like this because he had a hand he was embarrassed of. It was all shriveled up. Little kids that are up here, If they see someone on the street that has like a fake arm or a fake leg, like maybe they're a veteran who lost their arm or leg or had a disease or something else, it's always hard for me as a young dad because my kids will do this. You're right? They just stare. And I'm like, come on, kiddos, come on. No. It's all normal. But it's not. And the little kids are not embarrassed like adults. They just say what they're thinking. They're like, that's different. And there was a man with a different hand. In all of his life, he didn't want to be that guy everyone stared at. And in his culture, he was made fun of. He was probably viewed as not important or that God had punished him in some way. So this guy had a hand all his life that he was like kind of keeping like this. And one of the rules was that you weren't supposed to heal anyone on the Sabbath day. And Jesus is wondering whether he should break that rule or not to make a point. If you were with Jesus in those days, and possibly even today, you should know this. Sometimes following Jesus means breaking rules. Now, the Sabbath had gotten out of control. Because what had happened is Jesus actually made the Sabbath so that people would spend time with him, but the people in the culture of Jesus' day had turned the Sabbath into just another list of rules and ways to be busy. I remember when I was in Miami, Florida, which had a larger Jewish component than Powell, Ohio. We had a waterfront there. The church was on the water, and it was surrounded by all these big buildings. And all the big buildings, they had built with like a seawall. A seawall was like a cement wall between the ocean and the building. And if you were Jewish, one of the rules is you couldn't go for a walk that was too long, but if a seawall was built along the water, that wasn't considered going for a walk. That was just where you lived, and so it wasn't considered work. Interesting interpretation. And so actually, our church didn't have a seawall. It just had natural rocks falling into the ocean. It's since changed. They built something beautiful there. But the Jewish Orthodox rabbis, every year, would come to our property, and they'd gotten permission from the city to do this. They would bless a piece of fishing line, and then along all the lampstands around the church's property, they would place this like piece of tight fishing wire all the way around the church's property, covering the seawall and then back, so that Jewish people could walk along the sidewalk without accidentally violating Sabbath law. And I was like, just a young kid wondering, how does that help? I don't really know. If you go to Israel to this day, like one of the things that's unique about it is their Sabbath is Saturday. I remember one time I was there, if you're in Jerusalem and you are staying on the 14th floor of a hotel, that's a problem. Why? Because on that day, it is considered work to push a button on the elevator. And so if you get in the elevator in Israel on the Sabbath, guess what it does? It stops automatically on every single floor so that you don't have to push a button, so that you don't have to work on the Sabbath. And so you wanted to be on floor 2, right? I remember just like, open, close, open, close. I don't remember what floor I was on, but I was wishing it was lower by the time I got to my room. And they have all these rules to this day about how to keep the Sabbath and what it is. And Jesus, when he came to earth, he had a heart for hearts. He was way more interested, less in the rules than the reason behind the rules. He didn't care if you kept the Sabbath, if you were keeping it for all the wrong reasons. When I preach a sermon, did you know that I can preach it because I love Jesus and want to tell good news about him? Or, very often, I can sometimes do it because I want people to like me and I want to be very popular. And Jesus knows my heart. And the best preparation I do every week before I preach a message isn't prepare the content, but prepare the heart behind the content. Because I know Jesus cares far more about why I do what I do than what I do. And every time he came, he was frustrating. Because you could never deal with surface stuff with Jesus. Every time he met you, he would start about so how's the weather going? And then within 10 seconds, you were talking about whatever was going on deeper in your life. He was that kind of person. And when it came to the Sabbath, there were all these issues, and the priests and the Pharisees and the rabbis were like, Jesus, you keep breaking all the rules about what you're supposed to do on the Sabbath. And then he would say, well, what's the Sabbath for? Is it for keeping rules? Is that the point of the Sabbath? And they would be like, whoa, what do you mean? He would say, well, let me do a little test. Hey, you with that withered hand, come up here. I would be terrified. But Jesus says, come on up here. And the guy is still like, hiding it in his sleeve. He says, come here, come here, come here. So he gets up, and Jesus says, reach out your hand. If you had a withered hand and were embarrassed about it your whole life, and Jesus tells you to get up in front of the whole church, is it easy to get up in front of the whole church? They're like, no, it is not. They're like, get up in front of the whole church with the thing you've been embarrassed about and hiding your whole life, and I want you to reach it out. I don't know why this guy even did it. Most of the time when Jesus talks to me, I'm like, no. But this guy did it. And he reaches out his hand, and Jesus says, hold it out. And he looks at the people in the back row, not you back row, you're good people here at Liberty in the back row. But the chiefs and the priests of the law and all the Pharisees were hiding in the back row, and they had their legal pads out, and they were trying to write down all these sneaky words because they were trying to find, it says in the text, a legal charge against him. They were looking for ways to get Jesus in trouble. So they were the ones with their flip phones out, recording it so they could post it online to shame him later. And Jesus says, hey, you guys with those phones, is it right or wrong to do good on the Sabbath? Should I heal this guy or not? And he knew what he was doing. They didn't want to say that he should heal on the Sabbath because that would mean breaking the law, and they were all about the rules, never about the heart. And they also didn't want to say, heal him, or they didn't want to say, don't heal him, because in their hearts they knew, well, God would want to heal people, so why can't you do a good thing on a day? Jesus wanted the Sabbath to be a time where you experienced God's presence. And they had turned it into a place and a time and a season where they were feeling God's absence. You weren't even allowed to do good in a time and a place where the one who does good was supposed to be. So this is what he does. He says, reach out your hand. And Jesus says, reach it out. And as he pulled it out, a miracle happened. And his claw-like hand that had been deformed for as long as he knew, it all healed. And the power and the strength in his hand came back. The text says that at that moment, they decided that they were going to plot to kill him. And what this text does is it teaches us and reminds us that anytime church and God and religion turns into a set of abstract rules that disconnect us from God, that has nothing to do with Jesus and nothing to do with the heart of God. So many people, when they think of church, especially ones that don't go to church, what do they think of first? Rules, judgment. I don't even know what they think of. A lot of times when I'm in a meeting or I'm on a plane and someone asks, so what do you do? Guess what? I'm almost embarrassed sometimes. Because the second I tell them I'm a pastor, guess what they associate that with? Judgment. Because the church somehow made itself by accident into this place where folks associate religion with God and God with rules and rules with breaking and breaking with judgment. Therefore, anything having to do with that must mean that God just doesn't love me and that's not a place I'm safe or even want to be. And so instead, the God we meet in Jesus is a God who walks into this world of judgment and rules and folks that had forgotten the purpose for why we exist and why rules existed in the first place. And Jesus walks up and says, I am a holy rule breaker. Reach out your hand. I am ready to show you what it's all about. Oh, friends, I want you to know this. Do you think God cares at all about the rules that He made for you? Or any rules that you've broken? Because I've broken a few. I'm just joking. I've broken so many. I've even been at times in my life where I identify as just a messed up person that God couldn't love. And even as someone who knows Jesus and knows the good news, and I even preach it sometimes, there's times where I go to bed at night and deep down in my heart, there's even doubts about whether or not God could love someone as broken as me. And maybe you felt that way too, I don't know. And one of the things I love about the Gospel of Luke is he introduces us to Jesus and tells stories about a God that you and I somehow need to meet all over again 2,000 years later on a regular basis. And he says, Chris, reach out that hand to me. And what you'll discover is that I don't care about what's happened in the past. I'm here to bring healing now. And I'm here to bring love now. So I have a little experiment to end this service, and I'm going to ask for your grace if you'll do it with me. It's not going to be easy, but do you have a little faith? Are you willing to try something new? Everyone take a deep breath. That was so hard, wasn't it? That wasn't deep. Take a deep breath. Close your eyes. Can you put yourself back in a church in an outskirts, dusty town in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago? It's not as big as the barn, but there's sunlight coming in through their little open windows. The weather's nice. You've got sandals on and you can feel the dirt floor underneath you, and you're sitting on little chairs. And Jesus gets up to preach, and he's preaching, and you're there that day, but you look down and you notice that your hand doesn't look the way that it's supposed to. Are your eyes still closed? You can do this. And you look down at your hand, and what you see is that it's turning all sorts of dark gray, black, brown colors. And all the sin of your life, and all the doubts that you have, and all the things that you've done, you start to feel your hand getting really heavy. Because all the brokenness of your life and your sin is now covered on your hand. And you notice this while Jesus is preaching, and so that what you do is you go to hide it under your sleeve as fast as you can. But then right in the middle of the church service, you can feel your hand getting all weird, and you feel uncomfortable because your hand's full of all this gross sin in your life. In the middle of the church service that you're sitting at, Jesus steps down and he walks right over to where you're sitting. And you put your head down, but he walks right up to where you are, and he puts his hand on your shoulder. And he goes, "Hey, Bruce. Hey, Marilyn. Look up." And you look up, and you're trying to hide your broken hand. But when you look up, you see this face that is beaming with light. And he's smiling at you. And you're trying to hide your hand the whole time because you don't want him to see what's there. But he looks at you and he says, "Hey, Chris, reach out your hand." And it takes everything in you because you're trying to hide it the whole time, but you actually kind of reach out your hand. And if you're able to do it right now, put your hand out. And Jesus looks down and he grabs your shoulder and he touches your hand. And you can feel these warm hands touching yours. And the second you reach it out, your hand's instantly turned back to normal. And he tells you to open your eyes, and you open your eyes. You can open your eyes. And when you look up, he's holding your hand. And instead of meeting a God who's judging you and angry at your messed up hand, instead what he does is he just takes you. And he says, "Come, follow me. I heal you, and I love you." Friends, the God that we meet in the Gospel of Luke isn't one that you'd expect at all, because the God that they expected to meet was the one that would sit in the back with a legal pad. But instead, the God that we meet in the Gospel of Luke is the one who says, "Reach out your hand," and you can take all your most deformed grossness, expose it to him, and he's not intimidated by it at all or turned off or grossed out. And instead, he grabs you and he smiles you. Every time I do a benediction at this service, I end with the same words. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord's face do what? Smile upon you. I want you to know, friends, that the God of the universe smiles when he thinks about you. When you wake up in the morning, the first thing that God does is he sees you wake up and he smiles upon you. I remember, like, when my little kids wake up in the morning, one of the best parts of my day is I'll see them come down the stairs. And sometimes what I like to do, I even did it this morning, I heard little footsteps moving. So I actually go to the foot of the stairs just so that I can be there when they turn the corner to come down that last step. And I smile and I just say, "Good morning, Gracie." Friends, the God of the universe is full of so much love and not judgment. So much grace and healing. And the invitation to you and me every day is to remind ourselves that whenever we feel like that shriveled hand needs to hide, there's a God instead who says, you can pull it out and know that my smiling face is upon you, and I love you, and I'm with you. Will you bow your heads and pray with me? Lord, we offer to you our hands and our feet, and all the parts of us that we feel don't belong in your presence. And we remember that there isn't a rule you wouldn't break to be with us. And that you see through all of the shallowness right to our hearts, and you grab us and you heal us and you love us more than we could ever imagine. Set us free, we pray, in Jesus' powerful name. And all God's people said, amen.